Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, no matter where you're at. I want to talk to you about something interesting. This is something I've never heard anybody else really teach about, never speak about, nothing. It's the idea that churches each have their own culture. And this is a struggle that a lot of people deal with, and they can't figure this out, and they can't figure that out. Because they'll go to somebody's church and they say, oh, I don't like that church, they need to change it, or whatever, or I've heard pastors, especially new pastors, say, oh, I'm going to go into this church, I'm going to take over, and I'm going to teach these people how to do something, and then they hit a brick wall. They can't figure out how to go forward, and they can't figure out why. And the reason why is every church has its own culture. Now, that culture can change over time, so it's not that this thing is set in stone. But when you go into a church and they sing hymns, or they sing contemporary, maybe they have a DJ on stage who scratches records or whatever. That is the culture of the church. Do they stand when they pray? They don't stand when they pray. All these different things. One of the craziest ones for me has always been communion. Now, I've visited lots and lots of churches. Communion and offering are taken different in just about every church. And what's really strange about this, I ended up going into West Philadelphia. Yeah, I was born and raised. And I sat there at what was told to us to be the oldest black congregation in West Philadelphia and probably throughout the whole United States. Like, it was really neat to be part of that. But it was the oldest black congregation of West Philadelphia, and of Philadelphia at all. I mean, you got to realize how old that is. And I started praying, or they said, they came to me and said, hey, you're the first white guy who will ever take communion in our church. And I started praying, God, don't let me screw this up. Because I know every church does their communion differently. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to screw this up and it's going to look terrible. And so I started praying, dear God, please don't let me screw this up. Well, it ended up that a man was put behind me and he whispered in my ear. He's a man from the church. He whispered behind me. Oh, and they put me at the front of the line too. And he whispered in my ear the whole time, hey, we're going to do this, you're going to do that, and told me what to do. And so I ended up not looking like an idiot, and things went off well. My point is, every church has its own culture. Some churches have seating arrangements, some don't. You got the hymns, you've got the way they pray, the offering, all these different things. Does the pastor leave the pulpit? Does he not leave the pulpit? Does he stand there and read a script? Does he not read a script? All these little things tend to put into the culture of the church. Now, I've been to some churches where the culture is very almost unfriendly. And that's just the culture of the church. And the people there, they know it, they're okay with it, or they don't even realize that they're unfriendly because they're okay with it. This is who they are. And that's okay, but the problem comes when we start to say, well, that church needs to change and become more like what we want. Well, no, that's their culture. One pastor I heard once, he got offended because people were telling him that his church was a beginner's church and they wanted to grow up and go get, fed better somewhere else. And he was offended by it. I said, no, that's the culture of your church. It's okay. It's okay to be the starting church. You get people going and then they go off and they find a deeper church where they're challenged on a deeper level. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just where you're positioned. And, you see these things as you go. So at some point, I'm going to do a full video on race and cultural diversity, because it really ties in all together. Because if we can understand that every church has its own culture, and that we don't necessarily need to force ourselves into that culture if we don't like it. So in other words, if I don't like hymns, then I probably shouldn't put myself in a church where they only, unless God puts me there. Now, if God puts me there, that's its own thing. But I shouldn't interject myself into the church with the idea that I'm going to change them. Like, I shouldn't, it's like getting married and say, well, I'm going to change the person I married. No, you're going to struggle the rest of your life and you're going to have a horrible situation. And that's the way it works with these churches. You don't go into a church and say, oh, I'm going to change the church. No, you go to the church. You enjoy being in the church. And you embrace the culture of that church. And if that culture is outside of your comfort zone, then either God has put you there to grow you, or you're at the wrong place. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. Then you go find a church. The only time this becomes dangerous is if you're looking for a seeker-friendly, or, you know, a church that's not going to really hold you accountable for things. And you get in there, they start holding you accountable, and you get mad and say, oh, I'm not comfortable here. Well, sorry, that might be God working on you and putting you in path, and you should definitely pay attention to that. So my point here is this: every church has its own culture, and if you're not comfortable in the church's culture, and God didn't necessarily put you there, then it's okay to leave. If you feel like God's saying, no, you got to stay, then stay and you know, do it the right way. But if for whatever reason you honestly feel like, man, I don't feel God's got me here, and I feel like, you know, I'm just not in the right spot, then maybe God does want you to move to someplace else where He can use you in a different way or something like that. Now, for the young people out there, and this is where I've always been, God has always put me in churches where I'm the youngest person in the church. Like, it's just been kind of part of my life that I've always ended up in these churches where I'm like the youngest guy. And I'm single. So like, I spent 10 years in a church where I was the youngest guy and single. There was no women for me to even meet at church. And that's what the situation was. So God may put you in a place that you're uncomfortable, but it's because He needs to bring something into that church that you offer. So be aware of that as well. But don't think that just because you're in a church, you have to fit in. You may be the outsider. I always was. I was the outsider, you know, that didn't fit what everybody else had going in the church because of my age mostly, and because everybody else was married. You know, and most of them were old enough to be my parents, if not my grandparents. So it's just something to think about. Every church has its culture. It may be age related, may not be. And if you don't necessarily feel like you fit, it's okay to leave, as long as you're not leaving on bad terms. And also, like I said, if you feel like you're being convicted, well, then that's not an excuse to leave. You've got to stay and be convicted. But those are just some thoughts, some ideas. And again, these are kind of fluid ideas. They might change a little bit depending on the situation. So I'm not saying, oh yeah, you should just leave your church. What I'm saying is you got to weigh it out and see what's going on. But don't go into a church and demand that the church match you when you go in. And the final thing where this came up really heavily was, I was at a school and we had some kids that were rising up and saying the school was racist. Now, the school was literally like 99% white people that came from a very specific type of church. And this was a college that I went to. And so you have like 99% of the students come from a very specific type of church. And they're all white. And then we had this small group of minority students that were there. And they decided, well, the school is racist because they don't have gospel music. Well, no, that's not what's happening. The school's not racist because they have gospel or don't have gospel music. That's the culture, that they don't have gospel music. So when you choose to go there, then you match their culture. The same way as I would not go to a black congregation church and demand that they sing white contemporary worship music, right? It's not, that would be wrong for me to do it, and it would be wrong the other way because that's their culture. So when I go in, I honor their culture, whatever there is. You know, if I've preached at a Catholic church and I had to honor their culture in the Catholic church, which was very difficult for me because I wasn't used to it. When I go to Africa and I preach, I have to honor their culture, and there's certain things that have to take place there. So culture is difficult to deal with because a lot of times people get offended when it comes up, but it's something that if you understand it, then it can help you a lot more. So that's my little tidbit for right now. And thank you for watching. And I hope you were blessed. And there's more to come. Thank you.